Welcome to News Global, where we uncover the stories shaping our world today. In this episode, we dive into one of the most contentious and critical issues of our time, the long-standing border dispute between India and China. These two global superpowers, home to over a third of the world's population, share a 2,167-mile frontier marked by conflict, history, and unresolved tensions. Why does this dispute matter so much? Because it's not just about territorial lines, it's about global stability. With both nations armed with nuclear weapons and commanding significant influence in the world economy, even the smallest escalation could have catastrophic consequences. Stay tuned as we unravel the historical roots of this conflict, the geopolitical stakes, and what it means for the future of Asia and the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to News Global for more in-depth stories that keep you informed. Let's explore together. Picture this, a cold, moonless night in the high-altitude regions of Ladakh. The silence is shattered by the faint hum of drones overhead and the distant rumble of armored vehicles. Thousands of soldiers stand poised on either side of the line of actual control, a border that has been more a flashpoint than a line of peace. Suddenly, a miscalculated move, a patrol venturing too far, or an accidental skirmish, sparks a clash. Within hours, what begins as a border scuffle escalates into a full-blown conflict. On one side, the Indian Army, backed by advanced defense systems and global allies, fights to protect its sovereignty. On the other, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, equipped with cutting-edge technology and sheer numbers, pushes aggressively. Fighter jets roar across the skies, cyber attacks disable critical infrastructure, and economic warfare unfolds in parallel as the world watches in horror. But this isn't just a regional war. These two nations represent 35% of the global population and nearly a quarter of the world's economy. The stakes are unimaginably high. Trade routes are disrupted, alliances are tested, and the possibility of nuclear escalation looms ominously. What would such a war mean for the world? Could diplomacy prevent the unthinkable, or would the conflict spiral into chaos, reshaping the global order? In today's episode, we'll delve into this terrifying scenario, exploring how history, geopolitics, and sheer miscalculation could lead to a crisis of unimaginable proportions. Don't miss this gripping analysis of a conflict that must never happen, but could. Stay tuned, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to News Global. This is the story of a war we hope the world never sees. For decades, India and China, two of the world's most populous and powerful nations, have been locked in a complex and volatile border dispute. Sharing a 2,167-mile frontier, the contested regions span some of the most rugged and remote terrain on Earth. This unresolved tension between nuclear-armed superpowers is not just a relic of history but a critical flashpoint with global implications. China's historical view of its periphery as 5 fingers of its right hand reflects its long-standing territorial aspirations. The so-called fingers, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Arunachal Pradesh, and Ladakh, are seen as integral to its strategic vision. While this policy has lain dormant, recent geopolitical developments suggest a revival of these ambitions cannot be entirely dismissed. The Sino-Indian border issue stems from ambiguities left by colonial-era cartography, with lines drawn without the consent of the nations involved. The contested regions include Arunachal Pradesh, which China claims as southern Tibet, the Siliguri Corridor, a narrow strip vital for India's connectivity, and Ladakh, a strategic area bordering both Tibet and Pakistan. Overlapping claims from Nepal and Bhutan further complicate matters, making this one of the world's most intricate border disputes. Tensions culminated in the 1962 Sino-Indian War, triggered by conflicting territorial claims and the Tibetan Uprising of 1959. The war ended in a Chinese victory, with Beijing retreating to the Line of Actual Control, LAC, which still serves as the de facto border. Casualty figures remain disputed, but the psychological scars run deep in both nations. In the early years of their independence, both India and China adopted delaying strategies rather than directly addressing their border issues. India's unilateral moves in Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh, coupled with China's focus on consolidating control over Tibet, set the stage for long-term discord. By the time leaders attempted to engage diplomatically, mutual suspicion had eroded trust. Today, a conflict between these two giants would be catastrophic. Together, India and China account for 35% of the world's population and 21% of its GDP. Beyond the immediate devastation, a war would destabilize the global economy and potentially draw in other powers. While outright war seems unlikely, skirmishes along the LAC and aggressive posturing continue to threaten peace. Both nations have heavily militarized the border, and accidental incursions in the poorly defined regions are common. Moreover, China's growing ties with Pakistan and its Belt and Road Initiative amplify India's strategic concerns. The border dispute is more than a regional issue, it's a barometer for global stability. Any escalation could ripple across economies and alliances worldwide. As we watch this quiet but devastating power struggle unfold, one thing remains clear: resolving this conflict is not just a matter of regional peace but a necessity for the world. The border dispute between India and China is one of the most significant yet underappreciated geopolitical issues of our time. It's not just a clash over remote and rugged terrain, it's a deeply rooted conflict shaped by history, nationalism, and the quest for regional dominance. From my perspective, the most alarming aspect of this situation is how easily it could escalate. Both nations have invested heavily in militarizing the border, and the poorly defined boundaries leave plenty of room for accidents or misunderstandings. These small incidents have the potential to spiral into larger conflicts, particularly when both governments face domestic pressures to project strength. Another point of concern is the involvement of third parties. China's close relationship with Pakistan and India's growing ties with the United States create a volatile web of alliances. If a conflict were to erupt, it's unlikely to remain contained to these two nations. A regional war could draw in other powers, destabilize Asia, and disrupt the global economy. However, what stands out to me is the missed opportunities for resolution. Both India and China had multiple chances to settle their disputes diplomatically, particularly in the early years after their independence. The reluctance of both sides to confront the issue, compounded by mistrust and unilateral actions, allowed the dispute to fester. Today, it's not just about territory, it's about pride, strategy, and power. Both nations see the border regions as vital to their security and influence. For India, these areas represent sovereignty and connectivity to its northeastern states. For China, they are gateways to its broader ambitions, including closer ties with Pakistan and control over Tibet. While war is unlikely in the immediate future, the possibility can't be ignored. What's needed is proactive diplomacy, confidence-building measures, and mechanisms to manage incidents at the border. Both sides need to prioritize dialogue over posturing, recognizing that a peaceful resolution benefits not just them but the entire world. In my view, this is more than a bilateral issue. It's a test of the global community's ability to prevent conflict in an era of rising nationalism and geopolitical competition. Let's hope that cooler heads prevail and that this potential flashpoint remains just that, a potential, never a reality. The border dispute between India and China represents a complex blend of historical, geographical, and political tensions. This conflict is not merely about a mountainous frontier, but also about national identities, security perceptions, and regional dominance. Historical records highlight significant differences in how the two nations perceive the demarcation of the border. India argues that the western sector was defined by the 1842 agreement between Tibet and Kashmir, while the eastern sector was finalized under the Simla Agreement, 1913 to 1914. In contrast, China asserts that no formal treaty has ever been signed regarding the borders, viewing agreements involving Tibet as invalid. Notably, China regards India's establishment of the state of Arunachal Pradesh as a unilateral and illegitimate occupation of Tibetan territory. Geographically, India claims the border spans 3,488 kilometers, while China contends it is no more than 2,000 kilometers. Both nations have conflicting claims across the western, middle, and eastern sectors. Disputes in the eastern region, especially regarding the McMahon Line, remain at the heart of these tensions. Clashes and the search for peace. The 1962 war left the two nations at odds, with the Line of Actual Control, LAC, acting as a tenuous peace boundary. India insists the LAC should be based on pre-1962 military positions, while China argues for the status quo post-war. These differing interpretations have fueled ongoing military tensions. Recent years have witnessed escalating clashes and fortifications along the border. In 2020, a deadly skirmish in the Ladakh region reignited hostilities, highlighting the volatility of the situation. Both sides have since ramped up infrastructure development, with India constructing roads and bridges while China builds settlements in disputed areas. Personal reflections and future outlook. This issue extends beyond India and China, with ramifications for the entire Asian region and global geopolitics. Both nations appear committed to asserting their regional dominance while safeguarding national pride. Yet, the prospect of a full-scale war seems unlikely. The logistical challenges of warfare in the Himalayas, combined with economic repercussions and global consequences, make such a scenario unappealing for either side. India's efforts to counter China's economic influence are particularly noteworthy. By positioning itself as an alternative to China's debt-trap diplomacy, India is offering neighboring nations new avenues for support. This strategic move not only enhances India's regional influence but also creates a potential counterbalance to China's growing global reach. Ultimately, resolving the India-China border dispute will require time, diplomacy, and mutual concessions. However, maintaining peace in the meantime is crucial for both nations. This situation underscores the delicate balance between national interests and international stability. The pressing question remains, will these two giants find a path to reconciliation, or is this border dispute a harbinger of greater conflicts to come? The historical ties between China and India were significant factors in the development of both civilizations. Modern history, however, saw their shared struggles with colonizers, India under the British and China under the Japanese. Despite their colonial challenges, Indian leaders supported China's resistance against Japan. In 1939, future Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru visited China as an honored guest. During this period, the two nations helped each other, with India opposing Western imperialism alongside China, and China supporting India's independence movement. After India gained independence in 1947 and the People's Republic of China, PRC, was established in 1949, their relationship remained amicable. India was among the first nations to recognize the PRC, and Nehru visited China in 1954, marking a high point in their diplomatic ties. Both nations jointly advocated for peaceful coexistence. However, this peace was short-lived. In 1950, the PRC forcibly took over Tibet, which strained relations as India had strong cultural and economic ties with the region. In 1959, the Dalai Lama fled to India after a failed rebellion against Chinese control, further souring relations. Mao Zedong perceived India's asylum for the Dalai Lama as support for Tibetan rebels. Tensions escalated when China rejected the McMahon Line, the border delineated in 1914 by Britain and Tibet. By 1959, border skirmishes began, with China encroaching on Indian territory. In 1962, these tensions culminated in a war, where China captured significant Indian territory. Mao sought to demonstrate China's strength to deter India from aligning with the United States during the Cold War. While China withdrew most troops following international pressure, it retained control over the Oxai Chin region, a contentious issue to this day. Post-war, both nations maintained fragile peace, marked by intermittent border clashes. Agreements were reached to avoid the use of firearms in disputed areas, but these measures have not resolved underlying tensions. China's economic rise under Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, added further complexity. The BRI sought to expand China's global influence through infrastructure investments, often creating economic dependencies in recipient nations. Strategically, the String of Pearls, a series of Chinese ports and bases encircling India, posed a direct challenge to India's security. India responded with its Necklace of Diamonds strategy, building alliances and naval access to counter China's encirclement. Partnerships with Singapore, Indonesia, and Oman provided India with strategic leverage over key maritime choke points. These moves were complemented by India's growing cooperation with the United States, especially after China's actions on their shared border in 2020. The economic interdependence of China and India further complicates their rivalry. While China's manufacturing sector dominates global supply chains, India's efforts to position itself as an alternative manufacturing hub and a reliable partner in Asia are gaining traction. The story of India-China relations is one of cooperation, conflict, and competition. Their shared history underscores a potential for collaboration, but divergent geopolitical ambitions and unresolved border disputes keep them locked in a delicate and often contentious balance. India has strategically expanded its global influence by making significant moves in geopolitics and economic growth, positioning itself as a formidable rival to China. The country's actions reveal a multifaceted approach to not only strengthening its own economy but also countering China's growing dominance. India's expanded global presence has been catalyzed by its establishment of naval bases, agreements with nations like Seychelles, and investments in infrastructure projects in countries such as Iran and Mongolia. These efforts aim to create vital trade routes across Asia and Africa, enhancing India's role in global commerce while simultaneously providing alternatives to China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. The growing India-China rivalry has its roots in historical tensions and border disputes, which escalated after China's aggressive territorial expansion in Tibet and other regions. Over the years, India's relationship with China has soured, particularly after the 1962 border war and subsequent clashes, with the two nations now having vastly different territorial claims. While India honors the McMahon Line, China continues to challenge these borders, leading to ongoing military standoffs. In recent years, India has capitalized on global shifts, such as the US-China trade war and the post-COVID economic landscape. India's youth-driven, English-speaking population and relatively low labor costs have made it an attractive destination for global companies looking to reduce dependence on China. Apple, for example, has already begun relocating its iPhone production to India, and other companies are following suit. This is further reflected in India's increasing foreign direct investment, which reached a record $83.6 billion in the last fiscal year, highlighting the country's welcoming stance for businesses. As India continues to accelerate its economic growth at an expected 6.7% in 2024, compared to China's slower 5%, it is focusing on securing economic alliances and strengthening regional ties. Through large-scale credit lines to neighbors like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, India aims to prevent these nations from falling into China's debt traps, a tactic that China has used to expand its political and economic influence. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, aims to create a global network of infrastructure projects, connecting China to the world. However, India, strategically located in the Indian Ocean, poses a significant challenge to China's ambitions. India's infrastructure and trade agreements, combined with its rising economic power, give it the leverage to counter China's influence in key regions. The ongoing India-China border disputes, especially over the contested Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh regions, remain a point of contention, complicating any potential peaceful resolution. India's rise is not just about military or economic power, but also its position as a counterweight to China in the global geopolitical landscape. As India invests in development projects, fosters international alliances, and attracts foreign businesses, it is emerging as a key player in a world where China's growing dominance is being increasingly challenged. India's ongoing efforts to position itself as a viable alternative to China are part of a broader strategy to secure its place as the next major global power, as both an economic leader and a geopolitical force to be reckoned with.